Welcome to those who are coming on in. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes as people join us. If you are here to learn all there is to know about vaccine research, development, and delivery, you're in the right place, and we will get started in just a couple of minutes. And given that my intro actually probably is the least compelling and interesting, I might start even sooner so we can get on, because we have 3 terrific presentations to come, actually 4, when I count Tracy Swan, who's going to kick us off in just a minute. But I'm going to give it, I think, till 9:04 and we'll get started. But you're in the right place if you are here to learn about vaccine R&D and delivery. And our proverbial lab to the jab series that was created not long ago. All right. I think I'm going to go ahead and start a very slow introduction as people are joining. But welcome, everybody. My name is Mitchell Warren. I'm the Executive Director of AVAC, and we're delighted to have you join us. You know, one of the things we are very fond of saying every May 18th is that HIV Vaccine Awareness Day should never be just a single day in the year, because awareness about vaccine development and vaccine delivery for HIV eventually, and for all other vaccine preventable diseases, is not something that should ever be condensed down to a single day. And we're delighted that people joined us here in early June to keep the momentum going to talk about vaccine R&D. Over the next 90 minutes or so, you're going to hear from 4 terrific friends and colleagues to talk about different aspects of vaccine R&D and access planning that is not at all unique to HIV. I think for all of us, when we think back over now more than 4 years since SARS-CoV-2 first began to spread and catalyze not just an ill-prepared global response at the time, and it's very timely given just last week, as many of you will know, the World Health Assembly met, and we still struggle to come up with a pandemic accord for our future. But we know over the last 4 years that SARS-CoV-2 highlighted many things in the global health environment that don't work, being ill-prepared, of being inequitable, of being unjust. But it also highlighted the power of science. And I think all of us who work in vaccine advocacy in any form or fashion recognize that the rapid development of multiple vaccines for COVID-19 is a remarkable testament to what can happen when science gets investment. We also see what happens when access doesn't get similarly invested. And you'll hear a bit about that today. This prompted a number of us at AVAC and around the world to think about one of the reasons that we did see such rapid vaccine development. And a lot of that came because of decades-long investments in HIV vaccine R&D. Many of the technological platforms, many of the clinical trial platforms, many of the investigators that drove the development of COVID-19 vaccines, many, not all, but many, came from working on HIV vaccine research and development for a number of years. And that really helped catalyze and accelerate the development of vaccines for COVID-19, which are by any description easier to make scientifically than an HIV vaccine. I mean, in the midst of that and looking at other vaccine development efforts, it became very clear that there was a need to kind of look at all of the steps that go into it. And I'm delighted to turn this over in just a minute to a dear friend, Tracy Swan, a consultant to AVAC and the International Treatment Preparedness Coalition and many others, to talk a bit about a series of documents we developed late last year called the Lab to the Jab. We're then going to turn to 3 remarkable presenters to talk about different aspects of things that we as advocates, as researchers, as policymakers need to be aware of when it comes to translating great science into public health impact. We're going to go through all 4 of those talks in relatively quick succession. Feel free to put things in the chat or Q&A as we go. And then we're going to open it up, and Tracy and I are going to facilitate, hopefully, a very robust conversation with all of you. And I'm going to introduce each of the speakers in turn, but I'm going to first turn it to Tracy Swan, who worked with us and a number of partners in developing the Lab to the Jab series to kind of give a high-level orientation before we turn to the other 3 panelists.
Well, first, I want to thank the other panelists and all of you for joining this discussion. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the Lab to the Jab series. Since access is really multifaceted, there are actually 4 briefs in the Lab to Jab series. They cover vaccine research and development, the role of mRNA technology in unanswered questions and potential, the need for local production, what's really involved with ensuring successful local production, and issues around equitable global access and how to optimize each of these areas. And together, these briefs really form an advocacy roadmap for development, production, and access to essential vaccines. And each brief includes resources for additional information, and they highlight in each area what advocates can do, such as including and promoting good participatory principles in research, asking governments that host clinical trials to impose access conditions on vaccines so that companies don't just say, well, we're going to charge what we want to charge, or you're going to be at the end of the line. Pushing for technology transfer, working with national health authorities to select the vaccines best suited to their national context and to implement them, and advocating for the use of TRIPS flexibilities in low and middle income countries to ensure access to vaccines. And with that introduction, I would like to turn it over to our panelists, since I'm super interested in what they have to say. Thank you, everybody. And if you have time, do check out the Lab to Jab sheets. Thanks.
Great, Tracy, thank you so much. I just put the link in the chat for people, and please do look at those when you can. You know, I talked about the benefit of HIV vaccine research and development and being a catalyst for so much, and I can't think of anybody to speak to broader issues of thinking about vaccine development and really thinking about it from end to end, from early science through to product delivery than Jerome Kim. And I say that because Jerome wears many hats, now the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, an international organization based in Korea, but working all over the world to accelerate the development and delivery of vaccines. But I first had the opportunity to meet Jerome when he worked for the US Military HIV Research Program, MHRP. And for those who work in HIV, you will know that if it were not for Jerome and many colleagues in Thailand and around the world, we wouldn't have the one critical proof of concept that an HIV vaccine is possible. Jerome helped conceive and lead what we think of fondly as RV144, which now 14 years ago, almost 15 years ago, demonstrated a modest benefit as an HIV vaccine. It did not move forward for licensure, but it did catalyze the field in remarkable ways. And Jerome went on then to move to Korea to set up or to take on the leadership of IVI, an organization that had already existed, but has really brought new energy into it as they look to develop a range of vaccines and some really interesting efforts around manufacturing vaccines on the African continent with partners all over. So Jerome, thank you for taking the time. I know it's late in Seoul, but we're delighted you're able to join us and delighted to turn the virtual floor over to you.
Thanks, Mitchell, for that amazing introduction. But let's see, I'm going to share the screen and jump right into it. Great. So this is a talk largely about something that we've been calling AVAC Africa, the Advancing Vaccine End-to-End Capabilities in Africa. Oops. And of course, it's not working. So there we go. Briefly about IVI. IVI, as Mitchell said, is an international organization. We have 44 member states and WHO as state parties. Actually, last week, El Salvador and Kenya both officially joined IVI. And so we are very, actually tomorrow, proud to hoist the Kenyan flag among the flags in front of the Institute. We have a mission to discover, develop, and deliver safe, effective, and affordable vaccines for global health, working in over 30 countries and over 50 sites in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. You can see them down below on the map. Our headquarters is in Seoul. We have a regional office in Europe, which was opened a year ago, and a country office in Austria. We are now officially opening a regional office in Africa and a country office in Kenya. And actually, Kenya will be the home of the AVAC Africa initiative. What you see in the upper right-hand corner is what IVI does on a day-to-day basis. They're broken down into discovery, development, delivery, and epidemiology and surveillance. So we end up having to do epidemiology and surveillance, as many people had done for HIV, for diseases that are neglected or actually don't even make the list of WHO neglected diseases, but have high burden globally. And you can see the vaccines that we work on, again, broken into discovery, development, and delivery, and epidemiology and surveillance. Down at the bottom, discovery would mean that all of these vaccines in various forms are being tested in the laboratory. Development implies that they are in human clinical trials. Delivery is for vaccines that have been approved, but where we're trying to introduce them, to get a WHO recommendation on them, to improve the performance characteristics or make the performance characteristics more compatible with the situation that exists in middle-income countries, where it turns out the largest burden of unvaccinated people exists currently. Our strategy, you can see the vision and the mission of IVI as the roof, the foundation of IVI as an international organization, then broken into the pillars that support the whole structure. IVI is a laboratory research institute. IVI is a product development partnership with vaccine development, epidemiology and surveillance, and vaccine effectiveness. Around that are the 3 approved strategic initiatives that IVI should become bigger and better at discovery, development, and delivery, that IVI should expand its global footprint. In 2022, we existed actually officially in just 1 location in Seoul in South Korea. Now, of course, you've heard we've opened the offices in Stockholm and Vienna, and then are soon to open offices in Kigali and in Rwanda and Nairobi in Kenya. And then finally, future-proofing governance. And I think Els had something to do with this also. She's one of the speakers after me. We were talking about governance. And during the pandemic, I think it was really clear that especially in the beginning, we really only heard one set of voices. And they were not the voices from the places that didn't have access, that had access to all the things, testing, vaccines, medical supplies to take care of people with SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 infection. So one of the things that IVI has, it makes us a little unusual, is we have a board of trustees. The board of trustees has 10 at-large members and members from each of the funding countries. And there are 5 funding countries. Korea, India, Sweden, Finland, and Thailand, but we had no representation officially from member states in areas that don't necessarily have access to vaccines and vaccine technologies. So we've added now 2 seats for non-funding members, and we're hoping that improves the ability of IVI to gather input from low and middle income countries. At the same time, we added an official global council, which advises the board, and again, is composed of all the member states. So the strategic plan really has informed our activities over the last 2 years. So what do we do? And it's easy to say that we enhance vaccine manufacturing capability, but it isn't only in the countries in Africa or in Latin America or in South Asia where we work. In Korea, which is a high-income country, IVI has worked with the government to improve the ability of the government to have self-sufficiency in vaccines. So in 2010, during the pandemic influenza crisis, Korea realized that the United States government could take all the vaccine it had purchased in the United States for its own use. So the government of the United States, we now call that vaccine nationalism. We saw a lot of it during COVID, but in 2010, the Korean government was 80% dependent on outside sources for vaccine and was the number 11 vaccine manufacturer in the world. And they made a plan called Vaccine 3.0 that wanted to take Korea to a point where it was 80% self-sufficient in vaccines and the number 5 vaccine producer in the world. And we worked with the Korean government through multiple industrial strategy steps in order to strengthen the vaccine ecosystem in Korea. And currently in 2024, Korea is about 50% self-sufficient in vaccines. And every step, the Vaccine 3.0 initiative, the Right Foundation, which takes things from the laboratory into the clinic and is really a critical partnership between the Gates Foundation, the Korean government, and Korean industry. These large research and development hubs, if you think CHAVI, the original concept, each one of these 3 hubs is like a CHAVI. And then the K-Vaccine Hub, which again is the Korean government's investment in building the factories that will make Korea self-sufficient in vaccines. But also depending heavily on having technicians, having PhDs that are trained in these R&D hubs to work in an industry that Korea hopes will be at the cutting edge and no longer making Me Too vaccines. So IVI has worked with the Korean government through each of these steps, partnering with them, providing input, and actually, in some cases, organizing some of the efforts. And it's really been a very productive partnership and a real learning experience for us. So we do look like a product development partnership, and the Gates funds a lot of us. IVI is one of only 2 product development partnerships that has actually had a vaccine approved and pre-qualified. And actually, we have 2 of them now. First was the oral cholera vaccine. It cost Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation $28 million from start to finish. There are 3 pre-qualified products and more on the way. IVI does these technology transfers, and we've done 13 technology transfers of 6 different vaccines to low and middle income country manufacturers around the world. And OCV, or oral cholera vaccine, is one of them. Vaccine number 2 is typhoid conjugate vaccine. It cost the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation $29 million, again, start to finish. The SK Bioscience version was pre-qualified in 2024. Biopharma's version is approved by the National Regulatory Authority known as BPOM in Indonesia, but it has not yet been submitted for WHO pre-qualification. Vaccine number 3 is non-typhoidal salmonella. It was actually an internal investment at IVI, followed by investment by the Wellcome Trust, with SK Science as a manufacturing partner. So you can see how, again, we don't hold patents. We do technology transfers. We work with companies, WHO and others, in order to get a product from the laboratory into the clinic for testing, to regulatory authorities for approval, to the other bodies like Gavi, WHO, SAGE, and others that make purchases or recommendations. And finally, we help to generate real-world evidence that allows a Ministry of Health to make a persuasive argument to a Ministry of Finance that this is a vaccine that they should pay for. Some of our new initiatives, the Africa Regional Office, hopefully, and the AVAC Africa Office will hopefully be opened by the end of the year. Actually, the regional director position and the Kenya office / AVAC Africa Office leadership positions are being recruited currently. And we hope that we'll have some highly qualified candidates to help with this. The regional office, again, we didn't get any. In Sweden, the Swedish government made a commitment for 5 years of funding in order to set up the regional office. We don't expect that with Rwanda. What we ask is that the Rwandan government help us as we go to funders to try and find funding to support the initiatives of the office. And through that funding, hopefully, will they be able to stand the office up. The goal at IVI was never to establish a regional office in Africa. We had always believed that having strong and capable partners was the key. And actually, during the COVID pandemic, that strategy actually worked really well because we weren't allowed to travel. But the board made us track every project over $1 million and report back to them on progress. And it turns out only one project, and that was a project run out of Korea, was more than 3 months behind. It's because we have people that we work with who are capable and have worked with us, and they can run things. And increasingly, we're hoping, and you'll see that in the AVAC Africa slides, we're hoping that they will be the grant recipient and IVI will be a subawardee, because it is really critical feature of what we do for a self-sustaining R&D ecosystem to have our partners in country be able to successfully apply for and receive and execute grants to develop vaccines. Another new initiative is something we call the Hong Kong Jockey Club Global Health Institute. And it is as it sounds. The Hong Kong Jockey Club is the second largest charitable foundation in Asia. It disperses 600 million US dollars a year. Yes, they're the proceeds from gambling on horses and soccer that are run out of the Jockey Club in Hong Kong. But 90% of the proceeds go directly into the charity. So that's 90% of the profits. And so what they asked us with Cambridge and the Hong Kong University is to set up a global health institute that would improve Hong Kong's pandemic preparedness. And IVI's portion of this is about $29 million. And we are doing pandemic preparedness and epidemiology. Also, it also supports scholarships for people with master's degrees and PhDs to do their programs in country where we're working, so as to create technical capabilities within the regions that we work, and also then to do process development. Process development is vaccine manufacturing terminology. It's the step in between making a brilliant discovery in the laboratory and testing it in mice and having a process that can be transferred to manufacture and scaled to 100 million doses. It's really important, but it's not research. And for that reason, it's hard to get funding for. And the Jockey Club realized that and provided this funding, which actually is core funding. So we are able to use it on vaccine number 4 and vaccine number 5. Vaccine number 4 may be Klebsiella. We're still working on the justification for it. So very simply, there are 5 I's. If you start at the bottom of the pyramid, burden or incidence is the first I. Innovation, which is the left side of the triangle, laboratory to licensure vaccine development. Industrialization is the third side. It also includes human and technical capacity or capability development. And then implementation, of course, because we have to be able to show that the vaccines are having impact. So implementation is 1 I, 4th I, and impact is the 5th I. IVI does that as a part of its mission, looking from lab to jab and being able to show that those jabs actually generate real-world evidence that the vaccines do what we think that they do. So AVAC Africa. I think everyone's familiar with the targets set by the PAVM, Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing. Now it's called PHAHM, or FAM. They would like Africa to be 60% self-sufficient in vaccines by 2040. There are lots of good reasons: strengthening pandemic preparedness, tackling endemic diseases, improving supply security, for having a stronger vaccine R&D ecosystem, sustaining vaccine manufacturing in Africa. So we proposed AVAC Africa with a mission across the entire spectrum: epidemiology, laboratory research and discovery, development, clinical trials, technology transfers, regulatory support, manufacturing, training programs, and then finally helping with procurement and demand generation, because for a vaccine manufacturer to be sustainable, someone has to buy the vaccine and someone needs to use it. But you can see on the bottom what AVAC Africa will do. On the ground, bottom-up activity, taking vaccine projects, the same way we used oral cholera vaccine, from end to end, to be able to establish those needed capabilities on the ground, in the field, in Africa. If you look at the PAVM or FAM strategic framework, there were 8 different programs. AVAC Africa actually works with a band of them. And you can see strategic area 3, 4, 5, and 6, and AVAC Africa supports all of those. So partnership with the Africa CDC in this very important effort to stimulate the growth and sustainable manufacturing in a vaccine ecosystem in Africa is the key. So again, the regional office and the country office are going to be very important in order to establish those capabilities. And you'll see some of the projects that, although the office isn't running yet, that some of the projects are actually beginning to be accumulated for work through the AVAC Africa project. And these are some of them. So you can see manufacturing support, the work with the Institut Pasteur Dakar, a very important effort developing a Rift Valley fever vaccine for Africa based on mRNA technology. A technology transfer to BioVac. BioVac is one of the few vaccine manufacturers existing now in sub-Saharan Africa. It's in South Africa. It does a lot of fill and finish of other people's vaccines, and I think everyone recognizes that during a pandemic, it wasn't the supply of drug substance. It was the ability to manufacture it that was going to be an issue. So OCV, the simplified version of OCV, is actually being technology transferred to BioVac. We're successfully through the first 2 phases of it. BioVac now reports that they are at the 200-liter scale for one of the 2 strains that's in the vaccine, which is a really remarkable step. They're scaling up the second strain, and we're hoping that this will be, if we succeed, the first successful technology transfer of end-to-end manufacturing to BioVac, which is really critical. DEK is a small company in Ghana, which right now is doing fill and finish, primarily of the OCV simplified version. You can see the development, the clinical trials that are beginning to be accumulated, and the setup of clinical trial sites under something called AVAC, which is developing phase 3 clinical trial capabilities in West Africa, with a view then to use it initially for the testing of a Lassa fever vaccine. The mRNA Rift Valley fever vaccine is done with Afrigen as the primary applicant, with IVI as a backup or a subawardee. The same is true of ARQUA. We are partnered with MRC Gambia in that activity. You can see some of the other ones, including the real-world effectiveness of cholera vaccines in Mozambique. This is a Wellcome Trust-funded effort. Again, INS, the NIH of Mozambique, is the lead applicant, and IVI is the subawardee. We think that it's really important that investigators in the countries where we work take responsibility for securing the funding and then executing the funding. And IVI is really happy to be in a position to support these great partners. Just to give you a final thing as an example. So looking at BioVac, you can see the entire spectrum of epidemiology, of discovery, development, and delivery, access and uptake at the end. And you can see how the simplified oral cholera vaccine is now being technology transferred to BioVac through all these different steps. And we don't have all the funding yet. We're still applying for funding for the phase 3 for the bridging study to show that this OCV is similar to the one that's being manufactured by U Biologics, a small company in Korea, which has a pre-qualified OCVS. And it's a really exciting development. Again, the funding went directly to BioVac with IVI as a subawardee. And we do that, again, out of a commitment to building and working with partners to enhance their capabilities. OCV is one of those unusual things. We thought we were fine, we made enough. There were new programs that were trying to eliminate cholera, reduce the number of deaths by 90% by 2030. And then pandemic struck, and right after that, cholera cases took off. We've completely wiped out the 70 million dose stockpile. The 2.5 million doses that are made every month are all the doses that exist. And so OCVS is a way to dramatically increase the supply by 30%. So it's a simplified formulation. It also lowers the cost by 30%. So cheaper, more plentiful oral cholera vaccine manufactured by a South African manufacturer. It is the model that we would like to use for building capabilities by partner in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, the same slide that I showed before, the 5 I's: incidence, innovation, industrialization, implementation, and impact. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim. Should we take a couple of questions now, if anyone has one? You're welcome to also put them in the chat. While we're waiting to see if people have questions, I actually have one.
Okay.
We often hear, when we hear about vaccine pricing, is how much it costs to develop them, let alone to produce them, including opportunity costs and all sorts of things. So you have developed 2 vaccines for less than $30 million each. It's been very helpful in other work I do as an advocate, say for hepatitis C direct-acting antivirals, to say, wow, this pill cost like $1. Why is it being sold for $1,000? Would you be interested in publishing this information to support some advocacy around affordable vaccines? Thank
So
you.
we actually, the story of OCV, and this, it doesn't go all the way through to the simplified version, which was just WHO qualified at the end of last year, but it does have the OCV story, and we're working on the one for typhoid conjugate vaccine. So these do not reflect NPV, net present value, or any of the opportunity cost things that companies factor in. This is what it costs the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation from start to finish, including paying for the activities, for some of the activities at the vaccine manufacturers. I don't think that we could do it, and I'm not being facetious. We had a really interesting discussion around a Group A strep vaccine, a vaccine for something that causes strep throat in the United States is the cause of about 500,000 deaths annually, and there is no vaccine and no major companies working on it. So we had an industry roundtable, which I thought was really fascinating, because the one thing that I learned that I wasn't quite expecting was a statement from a senior, very senior vice president from one of the companies. And they said, you know, it isn't that this vaccine would generate $4 billion in revenue for us. The issue is that it's competing against something, a monoclonal antibody or something new against cancer, that we will sell for $13,000 a dose and will be a $13 billion product. And that's your competition. Well, it's hard to compete against that. So we work with companies that we think can get vaccines that can be pre-qualified, that can be sold to Gavi. And OCV is a good example. The price to Gavi is $1.30 a dose. That's the original formulation. The newer formulation will be cheaper. But the goal again is to get the vaccines out there and get them used. And companies in the DCVMN, Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Network, has companies that are willing to do that. Actually, Mitchell will tell you the story at one point, possibly, about a similar effort that we tried to do if the Sanofi GSK vaccine, the Prime Boost vaccine, was a success, and it wasn't. It was stopped for futility. The companies didn't want to necessarily manufacture it, so we had developed a model for doing a technology transfer of those vaccines, as we do for the vaccines that IVI has in its portfolio, to developing country vaccine manufacturers. So of course, all of that was made unnecessary because of the results of the trial. But it is a real problem, and finding the right partners is really a critical part, and finding them early, because if you can only go so far with contract manufactured batches of a vaccine. What you really need is a company that can manufacture things in bulk and for low cost.
Well, thank you so much. I see a question in the chat. Ottoman, do you want to ask it since you're right here?
Yes, for sure. Well, thank you for the presentation. And I'm wondering if you are facing any IP or patent barriers while developing these vaccines. Are they all off patent? And if yes, how are you addressing the IP issue?
So our vaccines don't have patents. The thing about vaccines is that they're really about know-how. And so when we do a technology transfer, it used to be a stack of papers and SOPs. Now it's an electronic file of hundreds of pages of, this is how we do the vaccine. This is how we prove the identity of the product as it's going through all the steps in manufacturing. It was said, I think, that the BioNTech mRNA vaccine had 50,000 individual steps. Well, you can imagine all those SOPs associated with those steps. If you didn't have it, you'd have to create it from scratch. And some companies have the means and the interest in doing it. But for many of the companies that are operating in the in the global health space, they don't make, $150 per dose. A vaccine that's sold for $3 or $2.40 now to Gavi, pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, is sold for $200 in the United States. And we have to figure out what that difference in price means. But for our vaccines at $1.30, companies are making a profit, but it's not an exorbitant one. And it means that they can't necessarily do the investment in a complicated vaccine on their own, which is why typically we come up with a technology and we partner with a funder and a company in order to get it through the clinical testing stages. So again, we don't do patents. We do get into patent issues sometimes, and someone raised this issue that a company that was taking one of our vaccines in transfer said, and so if we do modifications, we might be able to patent this vaccine in our country and exclude you from doing any other technology transfers to any other companies in the country. So we got around that problem by publishing things. We publish, and so there's no way that you can claim that you have something unique because the publication is out there. And that was the advice from our lawyers, also because we don't have the means to keep patents going anyway. And then when we have to work with a company, or when we are partnered with a company, we work with funding organizations that require global access, like CEPI, or the Wellcome Trust, or the Wright Foundation in Korea uses the Gates Foundation template for global access. So it doesn't necessarily guarantee that the vaccines will be low cost, but when you think about the market for a leptospirosis vaccine or non-typhoidal salmonella vaccine, it's not going to be one where typically you're going to be able to charge $200 a dose, or even $100 a dose would be very exorbitant for a global health vaccine.
Well, if there are no more questions, this might be a great segue into starting Othoman's presentation on access. But before I introduce you, Othoman, does anybody else have a question? We'll have some time after this for people who do. So I'm going to introduce Othoman. Othoman Mellouk is the program lead of the Intellectual Property and Access to Medicines program at the International Treatment Preparedness Coalition. He's an expert in the field of access to medicines with a special focus on intellectual property. Since the late 1990s, he's worked to remove intellectual property barriers to affordable, quality, generic, and biosimilar health products in low and middle income countries. And today, Othoman will be describing the global vaccine access landscape, where we are now, and how to increase equitable access to vaccines. Thank you, Othoman.
Thank you, Tracy. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So yes, I am going to share with you some of our thoughts and also the work that we have done as a Make Medicine Affordable campaign, launched by ITPC 10 years ago, and starting from 4 middle-income countries at that time in 2014, and we are working in 27 low and middle-income countries now. So if we go to the COVID and 3.5 years after we got the first vaccines, where we are now. So according to the World Health Organization, since the first vaccines were produced or launched on mid-December 2020, as by the end of 2023, 5-6 months ago, more than 5.5 billion COVID vaccines doses have been administered. And if we look at the population, we can consider as 56% of the total population of the world has been vaccinated with a complete primary series of a COVID vaccine. I think a lot of people think that more has been achieved, but only 56%. And if we go to, if we consider people who finished the primary course of vaccination plus one booster, only 28% of the world population has been vaccinated. Now, this vaccine, if we look by country, there is a lot of disparities as we see here in the map. So with the darker blue, it's the countries who have a high vaccination rate, and the light blue is the countries who have achieved less. So we have here on this table few examples of countries, and mostly developed countries who have reached more than 80% of vaccination rates, as we see here in France, Italy, Spain, Canada, Australia, and Portugal. But if we go to developing countries or low-income countries, and mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, these rates are very low. We have 22% only in Mali, in 14% in Senegal, 14% in Gabon, Congo, and in some countries like Yemen, only 4% of the population. This is as of today, or at least by the end of 2023. But if we go back on time in 2021 and 2022, where vaccines were really desperately needed in our countries, because at that time, you know, the pandemic was at the maximum. We had a lot of lockdowns, people were dying, etc. So at that time, last year, ITPC published a report of a study that we did in 17 middle-income countries. Some of them are in Asia, Europe, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, in Latin America, and Morocco only in Africa. So we looked at access to vaccines from 4 companies: AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, and Pfizer BioNTech vaccines, which were the vaccines that were mostly used at that time in 2021, which means the year after the launch of the first vaccines. So you have here the countries, and what we found is the following. Actually, at that time, in 2021, we had the majority of developed countries who secured vaccines for more to what is needed for their population. So we have example of countries like Canada, who secured almost 450 times more than what was needed by their country. And if we look at the countries where we were working, which are the countries below, we have countries like Armenia or Belarus who were not successful to achieve or to get vaccines even for half of their needs. Of course, this was due to the limited number of suppliers, to the limited number of quantities of vaccines available, and of course to the fact that the rich countries almost bought all the stocks and there weren't any remaining vaccines for the others. In our 17 countries, there has been significant delays in securing access to vaccines in comparison to what happened in North America or in Europe. So most of the countries started supplying vaccines only in 2021. Only in 2021. And the majority of vaccines were procured to our countries mostly by China, then by Serum Institute from India, and AstraZeneca for some countries. Access to mRNA vaccines, notably Pfizer and Moderna, came much later. Many of our working countries, the 16, were part of the COVAX initiative and have applied to COVAX to get access to vaccines. But at the time when we did this survey in 2022, only 3 0.1% of the total volumes of vaccines secured came through COVAX. All the other vaccines were procured directly by the countries using their government funding and using other sources of supply. Now, when it comes to the price, of these vaccines, the majority of countries have paid very high prices in comparison to the prices of the cost of production that was published. So we took as a benchmark prices the cost of a vaccine from AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson for 80 cents coming from UNICEF sources. For Moderna, it was 2.8, and for Pfizer, 1.18. So I would say the maximum, how would I call it? The maximum profit or the maximum difference between the benchmark and the cost paid by the countries were for Pfizer and Moderna. We have seen lower prices for AstraZeneca and the Serum Institute prices. Then, if we look at countries, the income of the country has no relationships with the cost of the prices that have been paid. If you see a country like Morocco, they paid almost the same as Argentina or even close to Europe, despite, the difference between the income of Morocco and Europe. Same of Thailand, which paid actually almost the same as the European Union countries. There has been very little technology transfer as that happened during the COVID pandemic, and almost none to the working countries where we were, with the exception of India, that got some kind of technology transfer from AstraZeneca to the Serum Institute. And of course, the lack of this technology transfer, the lack of voluntary licenses, and most importantly, I would say timely, at the time where this was needed, has created this situation of, lack of source of procurement. And mostly there has been no technology transfer in our countries. So the results of our study, and I put you in the slide in the beginning, the link for the study. I encourage you to go because there is a lot of detailed data there. The result and the conclusion of this study is that the existence of the IP protection has contributed to delay in overpricing of the 4 vaccines, that the global efforts were ineffective, either in terms of sharing technology, in terms of sharing the doses, the vaccine, the COVAX initiative, etc. The donations claimed by some pharmaceutical companies, but most importantly from some rich countries who donated mostly vaccines that were not used in their countries and that were not adapted into the developing countries where these have been sent. You remember J&J donations, including in my country from the US, France donating AstraZeneca vaccines to that were not used in Europe, to countries with young population where these vaccines were not really adapted, and increasing even suspicion of safety on vaccines, given these vaccines. There were some stories in the media in Europe, etc., that these vaccines were kind of dangerous in Europe, and then they were donated to some African countries with, people were suspicious, and maybe this didn't encourage people to vaccinate, and to some extent, this also explains the low rate of vaccination in developing countries, and mostly in Africa. The most supplied vaccines in our regions were AstraZeneca and Serum Institute, and to some extent Russian vaccines. There has been early VL, which actually is the case of AstraZeneca, which actually allowed Serum Institutes, but it was a selective approach that resulted in some delays. And of course, the prices have been quite high in comparison to the cost of production of such vaccines. Now, if we move from COVID to the mpox outbreak of 2022. So if you remember, in July 2022, WHO has declared mpox as a public health emergency of international concern. This was due to a kind of unprecedented incidence of mpox outside Africa, and mostly in North Africa and Europe, and among some specific population, and including men having sex with men. At the time, yes, we had this unprecedented incidence in North Africa and in North America and Europe. However, mpox was still and is still today endemic in some sub-Saharan African countries. And by the time when this fake has been declared by WHO, there was no specific mpox vaccine, so only smallpox vaccines that we think or that may be effective on mpox, with a very limited manufacturing capacity and of course limited stocks available. Mostly these stocks were available for the army in developed countries, the EU and the US. And in terms of therapeutic as well, there was a very limited choice. When we look at the situation of access to mpox vaccine, actually the same scenario happened as what happened during the COVID pandemic. So we are in a situation where we have very small quantities of vaccines available with very limited manufacturers. And again, while most countries were worried about the situation, we have the USA, who was successful to use over 1 million doses of the vaccines, according to the CDC. EU speaks about tens of thousands of vaccines that have been distributed and used by member states, according to ECDC. UK, 100,000 doses administered, and Canada, 50,000 doses. Once again, for Africa, no data are available on access to the vaccines. So even if during the recent outbreak, Africa registered only 3% of the global cases. However, the rate of mortality in Africa was more important than in North America or in Europe, while the cases is 3% only. When we look at the global deaths cases that happened globally during the recent outbreak, 12% were them in Africa. And while now mpox is still endemic in some parts of the continent, no vaccines are available yet. When it comes to international collaboration on mpox, the WHO tried to put in place some kind of support to the country. However, the support was limited. Only 90,000 tests were purchased and distributed to 5 WHO regions. There was no proactive advocacy for access, only a reliance on donations, using notably Murray protocol for one of the treatments. And if we look at really the number of donations, for example, for the Murray protocol, while 22 countries expressed interest, only 6 entered into agreements and were obliged to sign secret agreements. And to give you just an example, by almost last year, only 16 treatment courses were donated by Murray to Brazil and 3 courses to Chile. So in all the cases, this lack of access due to market monopolies, which are mainly due to, of course, there have been the issue of manufacturing capacity. However, we see, for example, in the case of AstraZeneca, when there was a proactive reaction of the pharmaceutical company to do a voluntary license early, to do technology transfer, etc., we saw Indian vaccines from Serum Institute reaching people very quickly. However, the majority of pharmaceutical companies have used the pandemic to file maximum patents. They rejected the TRIPS waiver initiative and oppose it very firmly. They refuse to provide voluntary licenses and support initiatives in that sense. And whatever, either regarding the previous vaccines or vaccines that will come in the future, the intellectual property patents and most importantly, evergreening patents remain for today and future vaccines the big issue. So if we look at the composition of mRNA vaccine, and I think the previous speaker have alluded to this a little, it's more about the know-how than about the patent. So to make an mRNA vaccines, you need an mRNA sequence, you need nanolipids to protect it, and then you need some excipients. And whether here we have the case of the Moderna and BioNTech. So as you see, it's quite similar vaccines. So if we look at mRNA, making mRNA, it's a very old technology. As you know, to patent something, it should be new. So it's not new. If we look at ways to deliver mRNA, if we look at how to protect mRNA from with the nanoparticle, all of these are old technologies and cannot be patented. However, as soon as the pandemic has been declared, we see here Novavax, Moderna, Janssen, and others filing for patents. This is only the 6 months after WHO declared the pandemic. If we look at other vaccines, this is what's happening with the TB vaccine candidate now. As you see, the first patents have been filed in the 90s, which means that this patent should have expired in 2023. However, we have a lot of evergreening patents with protection going until 2043 now for the GSK TB vaccine candidates. Same thing apply for HPV vaccines. Patents filed in 98. It was supposed to end in 2018. We have now patents that protect the vaccine until 2042. And the same thing with HPV vaccine from Merck, that the patent should have expired, the initial patents in 2015. And we have evergreening patents here that go now until 2043. So to conclude, I think the development of the vaccines and the therapeutic for current and future epidemic and pandemics depend on who is most affected. As you saw on the COVID, because everybody and notably rich countries were affected, we were able to develop vaccines very quickly and to procure them. And of course, these countries were first saved. With the case of Mpox, it was endemic in Africa for years. It is still, but pharmaceutical companies were not interested into developing such products, either to prevent or to treat. So the current pharma model is driven by profits and fails to address the needs of vulnerable populations. IP monopolies prevent products to reach those in need, and especially in developing countries. And the government support for local manufacturing has been key in developed countries. If the vaccines were developed, it was because the countries were committed, they make steps, they invested money, and they encourage companies to produce such products and make them accessible, which is not, unfortunately, existing today in other parts of the world. So the system in which we navigated for years now, that's don't worry for developing countries. We have India, which is the pharmacy of the third world, and India is going to supply all the poor countries. So it works to some extent on HIV epidemic when we see now that the majority of African countries and others are relying on India. However, this was not successful in the case of COVID, and we need to change this paradigm. The mechanisms that have been put in place, like COVAX, TRIPS waiver. We see what's happening now with the pandemic treaty discussions, etc., are failing. And what is needed is a really local and regional manufacturing initiatives that should be promoted and supported with a creation of ecosystems that are in favor of local production and beyond just announcements, and that address really the IP challenge using the TRIPS flexibilities and removing some other markets barriers that can be there. I think that's all from my side. So,
Othoman, thank you so much. And the combination of what both you and Jerome presented really do describe both some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities to take us forward into this new ecosystem as you described it. And so I can't think of actually anyone better to be our final presenter before we open it up for conversation in Els Torreele, who has been really one of the great thinkers for many years about how to reimagine R&D ecosystems and ensuring equitable access. And again, that linkage between R&D and manufacturing and impact, going back to what Jerome, you had described. Els is an independent researcher and advisor, and very recently, the founding director of AVAC. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I've been nervous for the last hour. AVAC, which is a new think tank on equity and economic justice for health. And again, Els has really been a pioneer in this space, and excited, Els, to kind of have you pull together what you heard from both Jerome and Othoman, and really, how do we take this all forward into really doing things differently and better? So Els, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the generous introduction. And indeed, I think that my presentation will pull together quite a bit of the elements that both Othoman and Jerome have already started. Yes. Do you see my screen?
Oh, yes, we do. It's perfect.
Okay. And do you hear me well as well?
And hear you perfectly.
Fantastic. All right. So, and I will actually indeed talk a little bit about the social contract that we have as a society around medical access and medical innovation and access to that. And just to pull back just a little bit, I think it's important. I think this public doesn't need to be reminded that, but sometimes outside of our global health world, people may forget that actually pharmaceuticals are not just ordinary market commodities. They're of a totally different kind. And so given that they are part of the right to health, it's actually a public and political responsibility to foster their availability. And that means timely availability, equitable and affordable access. And so that also implies that the purpose of health innovation and of pharmaceuticals is actually about improving people's health and well-being and public health, and not, as we sometimes hear when you listen to the financial media, that it's actually about making money and economic growth. The first objective is actually about health. And so that means that actually for policymakers, the question is like, what is the best way in which we can organize, direct finance, govern our ecosystem, R&D, manufacturing, and rolling out pharmaceuticals to actually provide this improvement of health. And so I emphasize on that because that means it's a political choice, and there is a social contract where actually policymakers design incentives, financing, rewards, etc., to create that ecosystem. There is no such thing as a market that exists out there. It is a construction. And what we see is that, at least in high-income countries, and certainly since the 1980s, there has been a kind of political consensus that the initiative and driving force is left to the private sector. And that is in particular in high-income countries. And Jerome already alluded to developing country manufacturers. That is a growing, industrial sector. But I think that their model functions a little bit differently. But certainly in high-income countries, it has been a pursuit of profit maximization. The market logic has imposed itself despite pharmaceuticals not being ordinary commodities, but because they are part of health, there has been massive public support through all kinds of conducive policies, also a lot of funding. We know R&D is being financed to a large extent. There is a high capacity or a high willingness to pay high prices, all kinds of incentives to de-risk private investments. And an important one is also to allow the privatization of knowledge and technologies through intellectual property rights. But in the basis of that, there was always an assumption that it is possible to create a win-win situation, a win that our health needs that can be addressed through medical innovation will be tackled by the private sector, and at the same time that it will work for them to fulfill their financial and economic imperatives. And there in blue and green, I've listed some of those elements. In green, all the public support throughout the R&D value chain that is made into this win-win situation, next to then the investments of private capital and know-how. But what we see, and certainly the last 20, 30 years have made it more and more clear, is that there is a growing misalignment between actually the health needs, or what we expect from that pharmaceutical ecosystem, which means developing medicines that address our priority health needs, provide therapeutic advances, and ensure that they are available when and where needed. And on the other hand, these economic and financial interests that have been pushing more and more the priorities and the way the ecosystem functions. And as a result, we have what we often call market failure, or what I would say as actually public policy failure, given that these ecosystems are being created through public policies. We have a multiplication of those failures. I mean, you are very well familiar with all the unmet health needs. AMR is a major example, but there are many others. Many of the new innovations are far too expensive. We increasingly see actually also stockouts of medicines and vaccines that should be available but are not because the market doesn't function anymore. And then not final, but another important element is that when you look at the quality of that medical innovation, like how many of the new therapeutics, for instance, that reach the market actually show added therapeutic value, this is very limited. I mean, more than half of the new therapeutic interventions are not better than what we have already. So that's a major inefficiency. And then last but not least, of course, we know that equity, the lack of equity, is a real issue. And we've seen it again in COVID, but I think many of you know that this is a recurrent theme. There's very few examples, I can think of none actually, where equity is built into the system. And so we have been for the past at least 30 years trying to come up with different ways, policy incentives, different ways of constructing that ecosystem. And the latest has been now again, as you all know, the pandemic treaty negotiations that just finished last week with actually a non-agreement. And where, if I can summarize the non-agreement, is really that we have two totally different visions about the pharmaceutical ecosystem. On one hand, you have mostly wealthy countries who basically think or kind of have convinced themselves that the medical innovation ecosystem works more or less as we want it, and it brings the medical innovation. And that, of course, the pharmaceutical industry and their way of working is key. And so that means continued intellectual property-driven innovation and a focus on markets and markets dynamics that can deliver, and where they think that access is something that can be delivered post hoc, can be achieved once the drugs or the vaccines have been innovated. Then we can create all kinds of primarily voluntary solutions that will deliver access. And then we have all kinds of charity responses, voluntary licensing, very much focused on mutually agreed terms. We also see that some of the responses are, we need to accelerate innovation, like the 100-day mission you've probably heard of around pandemic preparedness and response, in particular vaccines, it's kind of, how can we deliver the innovation sooner? But unless we change the fundamentals in the way we deliver equity, we will just have major inequities sooner, which I don't think is what we are really looking for. And then already mentioned, there is a lot of push towards increasing and decentralizing production. However, given all these limitations about mutually agreed terms, etc., often this means that the control over that local manufacturing remains with the multinational companies. And I was very happy to see Jerome explaining in detail how IVI takes a totally different approach, because I think that is much more aligned with what we then hear from the other group, LMICs in general, but during the pandemic treaty negotiations, there were two groupings of countries. One was called the Africa Group, and the other was partially overlapping an equity group of countries that negotiated with the premise, we need equity throughout the R&D value chain. We want agency to be able to contribute, co-create medical innovation, such that we can deliver or we can build health resilience. And so we need access to the technology, not just at the very end, in terms of producing the innovation that has been created in the global north, but actually become real partners there. So the focus has been very much on technology know-how sharing, moving from being a recipient of technology to becoming a co-creator. And I think nobody has illusions that this is a long-term process and difficult, but if we don't start it today, it won't happen in the future neither. And then access cannot be achieved just by voluntary commitments. We've seen during COVID what that means. We need binding commitments, which have been translated into a number of proposals, again in the pandemic treaty, but that have not been resolved, but around access to the intellectual property, the technologies, technology platform, access conditions on public financing, and a truly conducive ecosystem, not just having the factory in place, but with adequate access to financing, etc. And so what we hear more increasingly, and I'm very happy also to have heard that from Jerome, from IVI, how much there is a willingness and also a nascent capacity in developing countries to actually become part of the innovation ecosystem. And I recommend you to look at this very short video, not now, but I will share the slides afterwards, where actually researchers, developers from, in this case, Argentina, Colombia, Thailand, and South Africa, articulate how they are actually ready if you let them, if we don't stand in the way through intellectual property constraints, if we provide adequate financing and an adequate ecosystem, that they can actually do that. And so what we need is really a new social contract that doesn't only focus on the last stage, but really is comprehensive. And I think there is a fantastic market report that on vaccines that WHO did in 21, and where they really say that we need to strike a much better balance between serving national interests, global public health objectives, and commercial incentives. And this needs a social contract. This needs diplomacy and agreements for a new paradigm at the highest political level. And as some of you know, I have been working with a number of partners, including members of the former independent panel. We've also organized a Bellagio meeting where, Jerome, you were one of the participants, trying to think a bit out of the box. How can we create this ecosystem, rethinking for pandemic preparedness, but actually it is applicable much more broadly, because of course this is about the global innovation ecosystem. And just to summarize the key elements there is that we think that we need to really build that end-to-end ecosystem that was also referred to by Jerome for the common good, not for developing commodities that need to be sold at the highest possible price, but really health as a common good approach, with, of course, this equity and resilience to be able to address health needs when and where needed at its heart. And so one of the elements that we think is really important for that is this regional R&D plus manufacturing hubs, not just manufacturing, because then you will remain totally dependent of the innovation that will come with all the intellectual property and other monopolies attached, but really build that ecosystem such that innovation based on existing technology platforms that are more and more the basis of innovation today at its heart. And of course, it needs to be led by local scientists and developers. And it means that we need to have the means to drive such an innovation agenda there at the regional R&D hubs. And that means access to the technology platforms, ideally, that can be adapted to new pathogens or the local health needs, and the know-how. It has been said many times, but it needs to have the freedom to operate, that you're not being blocked by other intellectual property rights that may be valid in the global north, but at least to have the freedom to operate in the global south. I'm sorry to use this terminology. I don't know which one is the best to use in this context. Of course, access to skilled human resources and ways to retain those will be really critical, and access to appropriate capital that supports that public health mission, not venture capital that needs to maximize financial return for the investors, but actually capital that is an investment in health and in that ecosystem. It needs to be linked to independent clinical trial networks, obviously, and governed for public health purpose. And so that brings us to a new economic and health value proposition. And I think, Jerome, you made such a nice case in the for how things have been done also in South Korea. There needs to be this whole of government approach with different policies, from industrial policies to financing to health policies, regulatory, science and technology. All of that needs to come together to build that conducive ecosystem that can deliver for health. And we have already examples, and I think many of you are familiar with how Brazil has this health industrial complex that puts health indeed as the objective of the way they finance and support technology building and increasingly innovation. But there are others. There is Cuba. Colombia has started to go a little bit in that direction. And I just added while you were speaking, Jerome, South Korea and with IVI and all the things that you've explained to us on the slide too, because I wasn't aware how comprehensive that approach has been, but I think it's a great example. Also, Thailand has done that, and we've heard recently that Brazil's proposal to the G20 is really to set up a regional kind of like an innovation and local regional production for health alliance that I think could be on the same route. And so I think it's time to become quite more optimistic. We have examples, we need to amplify them and build from them, but based on that different social contract. And I want to just mention two more examples that I think are inspiring. We have seen this kind of network of global South developers and manufacturers that are building their capacity for mRNA vaccines and technologies with a hub in South Africa and technology sharing with 15 other developers. And that if we get it right, if we get that social contract right, not just letting each of these producers compete in the global market because they will all die, but actually create that conducive ecosystem, this could be really transformational. And I think another example is what we are seeing appearing in Senegal, the Institut Pasteur Dakar, who already had yellow fever vaccine production before the pandemic, but is now building its capacity. And I think it's also a project that IVI is involved in, and many others, to really become, and if you listen to Amadou Sall explaining it, he doesn't just want to produce vaccines. He actually wants to be a driver for that ecosystem that can supply at least Western Africa and maybe other parts of Africa with the innovation to address people's health needs in the continent, not be a major player in the market. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Great, Els. Thank you so very much. And
Thank you particularly for that the previous slide about a bit of optimism. I think for all of us working in global health, particularly coming out of pandemic, most recently coming out of a World Health Assembly that fell short of giving us a pandemic accord, recognizing moments of optimism and opportunity is the perfect way to conclude these three talks. Let me invite certainly all three of you, Els, Othoman, and Jerome, back on screen, and Tracy as well. We don't have a ton of time, but that was just such a remarkable set of presentations on a number of issues. I wonder if I might start maybe to just really quickly have all three of you weigh in. It was interesting when I think about it, you know, Jerome, you began talking about not only neglected tropical diseases, but even diseases that don't even make the list. I guess that's the very neglected tropical diseases, or I'm not even sure the right term, the ignored potential vaccine preventable diseases. We then have, Othoman, you talking about COVID-19. We obviously still think a lot about the needs for rolling out malaria vaccines that now exist, TB and HIV vaccine development, and Els talking about the pandemics of the future. I just wonder, what, you know, is there a through line in all of this as we think about HIV and TB on the one hand, diseases that are, you know, still neglected in some ways, but not ignored, all the way through to pandemics, and then the diseases, Jerome, you're talking about. From a vaccine perspective, you know, is there a way that we should be thinking about this? And maybe it's that innovation ecosystem, Els, that you describe, so that we don't, you know, I'm just wondering how we balance the disease specific and even the categories of diseases. And then there's these kind of through lines of vaccines. How might you think about helping advocates navigate that? And is there a framework that really should be front and center in our minds?
I can give it a first
Please.
try. I think, and Jerome, you're probably much better positioned to talk in the details of that, but I think that technologies are really the answer. There has been an enormous evolution, an enormous progress in technology, and I think for vaccines, we're having actually a handful of amazing technology platforms that have each their different characteristics, but also quite a lot of versatility, as we have seen during COVID, because basically even the mRNA vaccines, this was a technology that was kind of out there, kind of like almost, not yet, but and if you see, like we have had through 5-6 different platforms, we have had COVID vaccines developed. And I think that if we master these technology platforms a bit more horizontally, with many more technology centers that can actually play with those technologies, I think that allows a much more versatility to respond to also local needs. I think the pandemic has maybe given us the illusion that everything needs to be large scale. I think there is much more potential maybe to small scale, and there I think also in the manufacturing technologies, small scale manufacturing becomes much more realistic. So I think there is something there.
I love it. So think platforms, perhaps not pathogens, I think is a key thing. Go ahead, Othoman, I see your hand up, and then Jerome, certainly want you to weigh in. And then please, anybody else, please raise your hands if you have questions or contributions you want to make. But go ahead, Othoman.
Yeah, I think if we had to think in terms of new paradigm, I think we need to make sure that countries move from consumers to actors. And actually, when it comes to the local needs, and if mpox remains endemic in Africa, I think the solutions should come from Africa to develop the vaccines that are needed in the continent. And we should not rely on big pharma based in the US or in Switzerland or whatever to come up with the solution. The problem is, until now, our countries are thinking mostly as consumers, but not actors. And when we heard a little bit of some initiatives during the COVID, because everybody woke up, it's still in many countries, almost all countries have local manufacturing plans now, but most of them, the majority, are a kind of announcement, and they are not yet in the situation of practicing. I think what needs to be done is really what IVI has explained. definitely not every single country is going to be self-sufficient and produce all the medicine, but this can come through hubs, through regional platforms that are going to manufacture. But again, not just subcontracting for big pharma companies, but really developing an ecosystem. And I think this is very important. And I think the social contracts that, that Els was referring to, some people thought that actually it was delivering, at least in the rich countries. We pay, etc., but at least you produce. Now, this social contract, even in developed countries, is not really working. And I think what happened in COVID was really the proof. So yeah, we need to get to that. We need to go beyond, announcements and slogans. And I think solution will be found locally and regionally. And this is why it is important to have initiatives like AVI and others. Yeah. Thank you.
Fantastic. Jerome?
So thanks. And I want to say that this has been a great panel. And I learned always something from Els and from Othoman. But I think what Ottoman's getting to is something I heard at a CEPI retreat 2 weeks ago, which is that our approach to access and equity has to be intentional, not incidental, and has to be empowered and not vulnerable. And this gets to all the ideas about local or regional efforts to strengthen an ecosystem. And it's true, we will not have 55 different national manufacturers in sub-Saharan Africa, or in Africa, not sub-Saharan Africa, 47. There are going to be countries that make it, and they will be in particular regions of Africa. And, what's the model for sustainability? Certainly someone has to buy the vaccine that they manufacture. I'm not sure how far they'll get if they go head to head against Serum Institute on a cost and volume basis. So there have to be special set-asides for the local manufacturers. And Gavi has actually set up something. I think it's actually going to be announced in maybe next June 20th, the functioning of this AVMA initiative, which again is a guaranteed purchase of vaccines manufactured in Africa. And so what are they going to manufacture? Is it going to be they're going to make pentavalent or hexavalent like everybody else, or are they going to make vaccines for conditions that exist in Africa or elsewhere where there are no manufacturers, where the burden is largely in Africa? And as we think about HIV and malaria or TB, those vaccines are not going to be ones that generate billions of dollars of profit for major Western or high-income country vaccine manufacturers. The solution for those vaccines is also going to be a developing country vaccine manufacturer. And, and we should recognize it. We shouldn't hold big pharma to fault, because that's not their model. I think Els pointed it out. I was at a really interesting conference where someone else was talking about the model that the companies use to justify their stockholder-based, and it has generated some really remarkable things that cost a lot. And it would be great if we could find a way to make them accessible to low and middle income countries. And I think that's something that we have to work on. But the other thing is, and I just, Ottoman and Els, I was at another meeting and I read somewhere that the US government suspended patents. So it's very ironic that patent and IP for innovation was in that pandemic treaty. But for the purposes of the pandemic, in the Operation Warp Speed contracts, there were 50 references to FAR 52.227-1. FAR is Federal Acquisitions Regulations. 52.227-1 gives the federal government the right to suspend patents. So do you wonder why there were no lawsuits until after the pandemic was declared over? It's because the contracts that were done in the absence of patents. The US government essentially took responsibility for all patent violations during the time that this was in existence. And it was also the reason why Korea couldn't just get vaccine from the United States that had been made under the FAR, the Operation Warp Speed manufacturing, because those patent waivers were only applied to vaccine used in the United States. So the US government itself suspended patents during a national emergency. It turns out the Germans have a similar law. A 2020 German law has a similar way for the government to get around this in an emergency. What they forget is we're not talking about, this kind of thing for everyday routine, run-of-the-mill, pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. We're talking about it for a situation where, 20 million people are killed in a pandemic in the modern age. And so if you guys can do more research on this, I think it would be great. The person who talked about this was James Love from Knowledge Ecology International. And it was really kind of an eye-opening thing because they did a call to they used the open access rules that the federal government has, and they got all these things because they're all available publicly. And they pointed out that, so, there are laws within countries that allow you to do this in high-income countries in emergency situations. And I don't understand, and again, you guys are the patent and are patents experts and are thinking about this, but I'm not sure how, and I would love to get that slide of yours that compares what we wanted in some countries versus others, because I think that's really a critical point. Of course, no one ever won an argument with the US government by pointing out that they're internally contradicting themselves. But I think it's an important thing because not all the government knows that they did this, because I had just the week before an argument with a US Army person who said, no, we didn't waive any patents. But in fact, the contracts are there and they're accessible. So you can actually look it up. Anyway, so I thought it was a really interesting point, and it really fits in with what you're saying. I mean, for pandemics, but also now as we emerge, I mean, as IVI thinks about it, the neglected diseases and the high burden diseases of poverty are a legitimate target for research that for vaccines and other interventions that are accessible. And
Jerome,
we need a study for these diseases.
Sorry, I didn't mean to step on you.
Nope.
No, it's so wonderful, because I think what we all know but don't often practice is that vaccine R&D and vaccine equity is not just about the science. We say it all the time, but it's so multifaceted. And I think all three of you have really highlighted that. I know we're just over time, but this has been so rich. I do want maybe just to quickly just give you each, not even a minute, maybe 30 seconds, all four of you, just to give some last thoughts and maybe some calls to action. And I'll sneak in a question to Jerome, maybe to all of you, but obviously AVAC began 30 years ago, focused on the development of an AIDS vaccine. You spent a big chunk of your life doing that. How does all of this relate to something so far into the future, so far upstream? Are there some things that all of these conversations should help us do still around those upstream development issues? So I'll give you, I won't make you go first, but maybe we'll start, Othoman, with you, but it's some quick last thoughts of calls to action for advocates.
Well, my last word is whatever we do, whatever plans we have, it should have an IP component on it. Because this is unfortunately how the R&D model is in it. And I see those who are more inclined to offer technology transfer, but manage your own IP and let's go for fix it with the voluntary mechanism that exists, etc. So I think if you look at any local manufacturing plan initiatives, look at what is planned on IP issues. And I think we should not lose the momentum of COVID, because a lot of things happened, and very often humans have a kind of short memory and tend to forget and go back to business as usual. So I think let's keep the momentum and let's not forget what happened.
Beautiful. Els?
Yeah, building on that, and I totally agree, Othoman, with you. And I've reframed it a little bit into freedom to operate, because it's a positive narrative. And I think that that would be my call for action. I think we need to document what's going on, what works, and then say, well, and for this we need that freedom to operate. And to your point, Jerome, that the US and European countries, they use certain freedoms they have. And I think we need to document them, as Jamie and others have started to do, because the same people, the same governments have blocked the same thing in the pandemic agreement that other countries have asked for. But let's point out these contradictions, but in particular show what works. And I think actually I would like to encourage you and your team, and maybe there are ways in which we can help document much more all the things that you're doing. I mean, what Tracy was saying, like, I mean, if it costs only 30 or 40 million out-of-pocket expenditure, we agree to develop a vaccine that will make other public investors much less afraid of what they think, and they have been told by pharmaceutical companies that it costs billions. Well, no, it's not. And I think, I mean, and you know, my background is with DNDi, where we also try to say, like, look, it can be done, and it's not as expensive as is often said if you have a real technological opportunity and a medical need. And so I think if we can all document what can be done, in particular also in the global south, I think that will be very powerful.
Beautiful. Jerome.
So, Els, that's great. You know, Sir Andrew Whitty, who was the CEO of GSK, at one point said the billion-dollar estimate is one of the pharmaceutical industry's dirty little secrets, because it's not just the cost. And but so I think I'm going to end with you know, the Gavi and the formation of Gavi was really important. 25 million, 5 million children a year are saved by vaccines. If we fully utilized all the approved vaccines, we would gain another 25 million over 10 years, which is great. If we look at the number of deaths from the diseases which are infectious, for which there are no vaccines, it's 4 to 5 million a year. So over that same 10-year period, we lose 40 to 50 million people. As we think about that, vaccine development becomes something different, because it becomes something that can empower local or regional manufacturers. It can help address problems, you know, just the cost of clean water and sanitation, which is often used as a way to say, well, we don't need cholera vaccine, we just have to build the infrastructure. Well, that infrastructure is going to cost $100 billion a year to maintain all over the world. And so when you think about the cost of $1.30 for an oral cholera vaccine, we have to put things in perspective, and we have to kind of take a step back. But I think vaccines are a way to get the kind of development and the kind of protection that we really need. And it accomplishes, I think win-win would be a good way to say it, because we accomplish the act of developing the ecosystem, but we also develop vaccines which hopefully will help to address the 4 to 5 million deaths from infectious diseases that are not covered by the current vaccines that we have.
Jerome, beautiful. Tracy, and I'm going to put again for everybody's benefit the Lab to the Jab series that you led, and really hope brings a lot of these pieces together. But Tracy, last thoughts? Oh, you're on mute though. Important last thoughts.
I love going last because I get to agree with everyone who spoke before me. And I think a really key thing, besides using evidence, including IP, doing what works, thinking about how many lives saved, is it's really time that we led with optimism. The world is in such dire need of optimism, and to keep it framed that way, and to make the message about empowerment, for communities to have a clear-cut role to support all of this and to be totally engaged. And I just want to thank everybody.
Tracy, thank you. My optimism at the very top of my list. And Els, that slide, I mean, and all four of you have described reasons in the midst of madness to be optimistic, and we desperately need that, as you said. I take away from this so many important lessons here, but three that jumped out, from platforms to pathogens, from consumers to actors, and that equity depends on being intentional, not incidental. If we can live those three things, as a global community, I believe that we can actually translate that optimism into impact. And so I really want to thank all four of you for setting up this conversation and leading it, and recognizing that what you might not have known that you signed up for is how do we make sure that we don't let this be a one-off conversation on the 3rd of June, 2024, because if it is a one-off conversation, then we're going to be having it over and over again. But I think if we do lead with that optimism, Tracy, we can actually make sure that we move in those directions to platforms, to actors, and to intentionality. So thank you so very much. Tracy, again, thank you for pulling this all together, and we look forward to working with all of you on screen and on the call, and many others who will listen to this recording to really move impact. So thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone from AVAC that's in the background here that made this happen too. Thank you.
You are so right, and I failed to call that out. Thank you, Tracy, for reminding me. Mickey, Jason, Stacy, Jennifer, without you, this wouldn't have happened. But again, looking forward to many, many more opportunities, and to collaborating on an ongoing basis. Have great evenings, afternoons, and mornings. So cheers all.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Thanks.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.